Welcome back to All the Miles Mattered. Thanks again for coming along for the run. This is Neil Amato, and this episode is our second bonus episode. Overall, it's episode 17 of the show about Largo, Lato, and the challengers to those programs' distance running dynasties. If you're just finding us, I invite you to go back and listen to the episodes. They're all just a shade over 15 minutes each, and they tell the story of great teams and great culture that was created by coaches who cared and runners who were all in. For this episode, you can call it a long run as it goes beyond the 20-minute mark, but it's still pretty concise. These are some clips that didn't make it into the main episodes, starting with the story of Lato's Tommy Hampton, how he came to join the Long Red Row, why Lato had a hidden disadvantage competing against Largo, and how Lato counteracted that disadvantage. Once again, here's Tommy Hampton.
Going into the Lato program back in the early 80s, is when Lato was obviously, Coach Ennis was just really starting to make his mark with the program in the state. And I think that was the year, perhaps it was 79, that we got dubbed the Long Red Row following that dual meet at Jefferson. And at the time I was in junior high, and I really wasn't much of a runner. In fact, I was more of a wrestler. And one of the subtle advantages that many people don't really talk about that Largo had over Lato, on top of course, all the talent and the tradition and Coach Haley and his coaching abilities, was that, Largo had freshman class.
Right. Yeah, he could coach freshmen.
Yeah, and Lato didn't have that because it was such a huge school. I think we had over 3,000 students across just 3 classes. And in fact, we're so big, had to be in double session to fit all the students there, right?
Right.
And I think, Coach Ennis knew this, and he knew that in order to have a sustainable program that could somewhat compete with Largo over time, he was going to have to identify some type of pipeline that would allow him to develop runners, into his program by the time they were actually under him. And he did that through his relationship with Coach Zimmerman there at Webb Junior High.
Right. But can you remind me, do you know Coach Zimmerman's first name?
Yeah, it was Phil.
Okay, Phil Zimmerman. I've heard Coach Z, Coach Zimmerman, and never really gotten the complete thing. So Phil Zimmerman, he did it with help from Coach Zimmerman, and tell me some of the things that they did.
Yeah, so he did this through, with the help of Coach Zimmerman. And Coach Z, he was, if you saw the guy was all about fitness, right? I mean, he was just chiseled. And I think he actually was a bodybuilder when he was younger. I mean, at that time in the early 80s, I think it was, a national program for student health, and you had to see how many pull-ups you could do in a minute, how many sit-ups, could you climb a rope, and one of the tests was a 12-minute run. And I think that became the place where Coach Z would try to identify, potential runners for his track team, and then potentially develop that into the pipeline for Lato's program. I think at the time, I wasn't very good. I think I may have just made his informal cut, right? I think I may have run, 8 or 9 laps in 12 minutes, and you do the math on that, and that's not very fast, especially given, the talent that was around the Tampa area back in those days. But that, Coach Z had kind of came over to me and he said, "Hey, Hampton, why don't you give this track thing? Why don't you think about it? I think you have, some potential." So I kind of looked into it. That's when there was a lot of, the press and the Tribune regarding the Largo program, and then Lato was starting to show up, and it piqued my interest, and I started to do a bit of running. Ironically, when I think about when I started my running, I used to run in chucks, and I think on top of that, the pair that I had were like a cyan blue. So I think any normal runner would probably cringe at that, right? At the thought of, that's definitely not the right running shoe.
That's hilarious. And by the way, I'm going to interrupt you again just to tell you. So you heard episode 3 about Brett Hoffman of St. Pete High, He
Yep.
told me the same story. He ran in Chuck Taylor's and he begged his parents. I couldn't work it. I just didn't have the time. He's like, begged my parents to get running shoes and they just scoffed at how expensive running shoes were then. And I did eventually get them, but for a while I was running in Chuck Taylor's. So
Yeah.
you were not the only one.
Well, that's good to know. And it's amazing to think that that didn't lead to some kind of significant injury in my later running career. But having said that, I ran a little bit there at Webb Junior High, and I think both Coach Z and Coach Ennis would both tell this story because I think they kind of made it a comical but story they love to tell. Is I couldn't beat the janitors coming out of junior high, but I went ahead and I went that summer of 1980, and I went to the Lato. Coach Ennis had a meeting for all of his cross country runners and potential up and coming runners at the end of the season and before the summer, and he'd kind of just talk about goals for the summer and the summer running program. And at the time, I think there was the 500-mile club and there was the 750-mile club over the summer. And he knew at that point in 1980 that he had a legitimate shot at potentially beating Largo in the state meet. I think Leto was ranked number one in the preseason. And he just talked about that endlessly. And I remember just sitting in that room with that talent and those runners. And that's when it hit me. It's like, wow, I want to be one of these guys.
I can imagine. I mean, if I went and heard Coach Ennis talk about running and competing, I'd probably want to sign up for his team right away too. So,
and I think I put in somewhere between 500 and 600 miles that summer. And it was coming out of that summer that actually made me a legitimate runner, but I still had a lot to go, believe me.
Tommy Hampton absolutely became a legitimate runner for Lato. He's the focus of episode 9, which is about the 1982 state meet and Lato's first cross-country state title. And it's that race that is now available on YouTube. And Tommy Hampton wasn't just legit in high school. In fact, well into his 50s, he was running fast, like really fast, USATF Masters All-America standards fast. He's offered to advise me on running as a 50-plus guy. I'm really grateful for the advice he's given me as I pursue several running goals. But this show's not about me. I bring it up to say that it's another example of that community building I talked about in the first bonus episode. It really means a lot to me. So you heard how in that interview I was essentially filling in the blanks with Tommy Hampton about Coach Phil Zimmerman and the program he had at Webb Junior High. And why that program was important, because Coach Ennis didn't have freshman runners on his team, because Lato had 3 grades well into the 1990s. So the first time Coach Ennis got to see runners was when they were entering their sophomore year. Coach Z was definitely into fitness, as Tommy mentioned. He was indeed a bodybuilder, in fact, a magazine cover-worthy bodybuilder. The photo of that magazine cover will be on the All the Miles Mattered Facebook page and my Instagram at neil.amato. This next clip, at least the start of it, is another example of how a natural conversation led to me discovering new stories. This is a 2021 interview with Largo's Pat McDonough. He asked me early on about how many episodes I was planning for the show. I don't know the number of episodes, but I'm toying with the idea of making each episode 15 minutes and doing 15 episodes, because the number 15 in cross country is a big deal for 2 reasons. 1, it's the perfect score, and 2, you were legit if you could run 15 minutes.
Yes, correct.
And I just thought that would be a neat numeric thing. It may not work out that, themes make it that way, but that's my idea. Like I've got a lot of good stuff.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. I talked to Dan Lucas, who ran at Lato. I think he was a contemporary of yours. I've messaged with Trey Culbertson. Haven't talked to him yet, but I plan to talk to him. Obviously, I got Coach Ennis.
Yeah, one story about Trey. I think it was the Countryside Invitational. At that time, I had won every race, and I think shortly after the 2-mile mark, I was hurting bad. I think that's the worst I felt, all year long. And Trey came up and caught me and came right on my right shoulder And as he came up next to me, he said, "All right, now let's go." And basically was encouraging me to stay with him. And and there's a great photo in the paper with me out kicking him at the straightaway in the Countryside Invitational. He's in the background and I'm just in front of him, kicking. And the only reason I was undefeated that year is the fact that he encouraged me to stay with him. If he had just blown by me, I wouldn't have been able to keep up with him. But he came on my right shoulder and he's like, "Okay, man, Pat, let's go. Let's hit it here." And I just so happened to be able to outkick him the last 100 yards. And
Wow.
that kept me undefeated at that time. Ever since then, I've always had the utmost highest respect for Trey, because to him it wasn't about winning. It was just about, competing, and he wanted to beat me at my best, not at my worst.
It's a race Trey Culbertson remembers as well.
Yeah, I've thought about that comment. It was instinctual. He had been up ahead, left a couple other runners and caught up to him. And I don't know, part of it was to push myself. He was the number one runner in the state. And, I've been seeing him run since we were both ninth graders. And I don't know, it just felt right to try to pull him along. Because, I was feeling really good. And, he ended up nipping me at the end. It just seemed like that was his one race of the year where he kind of wasn't there, because then after that he just kind of distanced himself from everybody else and finished the season that way. Nobody could touch him.
I asked Culbertson if he has any thoughts about how those few words might have altered the season for the teams and the individuals, and if he had any regrets.
I don't know. I think about it. I'm like, deep down, I'm glad I did it. I know that was a real possibility, and that could have really changed, the mindset for the rest of the year. That was probably one of the best I felt all year. But once again, I did not wish him ill will at all. I saw it as almost like a teammate, but somebody that I respected being right there. And I could tell that he was just, at that point where it's like, wow, it's hurting right now today. But he, was able to hold in there. So, yeah, I feel good about it. It's interesting to hear that he remembers it too.
In the first bonus episode, Seminoles' Keir Breitenfeld had similar sort of deference for McDonough. Remember, he said he really wanted to beat a guy like Roger Letchworth, but he wondered if his own respect for Pat held him back some. It seems like Culbertson is expressing similar sentiment when he thinks about that Countryside race.
Yes, it was definitely not something that I would do with pretty much anyone else. And like I say, it cost me a chance to win a meet and take down the number one runner in the state. But it wasn't anything that I fretted over even that day. I didn't regret it after the race. So I wasn't upset over any decision I made. I stood by it and, moved on.
Again, that race was in 1987, the Countryside Invitational. That spot was then Brooker Creek Park. It's now John Chestnut Senior Park, and it was the site of several memorable parts of this story. It was where Coach Ennis listened from the other side of the palmetto bush to Coach Haley talking to the Packers about the course, and then Coach Ennis gave his Lato guys the exact same speech, subconsciously mimicking the Haley speech patterns. That park was where Jeremy Duplessis of Countryside saw a heavier version of Roger Letchworth less than a year after Letchworth's college career had ended. That spot was special to Roger and those who knew him. In fact, when Roger died in early 2019, at the age of 50, a small memorial service was held for him at the park. Here's Craig Florio, the friend who rode his bike with Roger on some runs, as detailed in episode 11. He's talking about visiting John Chestnut Park with his girlfriend after Roger died.
It was almost a year to the date, and I was with my girlfriend. We were walking the trails where part of the race would be, and I was talking about him. And as I was mentioning to my girlfriend at the time, this is where he would run, a cardinal, and this is not a lie, a cardinal, which obviously people think is a symbol for an angel, flew right down 5 feet in front of us on the walkway back there at John Chestnut Sr. and just sat there, came out of nowhere, was staring at us. And I looked at her and she looked at me, and we didn't really say anything for half a second. And I basically was talking to the bird. And I was just like, Letch, is that you son of a bitch? Just kind of being a joke. And it was just kept hopping a little bit closer to us, staring, tweaking its head back and forth like it was listening. And it just flew off. And I actually got emotional at that point. Yeah, I really, truly believe. And she did too. And she only knew stories of the kid and she never met him in person. But that moment in time when that cardinal jumped in front of us, as we were just pretty much conjuring up him and his memories, was pretty surrealistic, and overwhelming at the time. And I did start crying. I broke down a little bit. It was something to behold. And I don't know. I believe that it was him.
There remain many more stories I could tell about Roger, but I'm going to end here with one that goes back to his road racing career, where he truly made a national name for himself. It was mentioned in episode 11 that he held simultaneously age group records for the 10K and the 15K in the U.S. Bob Brayman, he's highlighted in episodes 2 and 3. Even when he goes on to become a coach at USF, he was still a standout runner, and he thought he could run with Letchworth in the Gasparilla 15K. That's a 9.3 mile race, and he's talking about one such Gasparilla in the mid-1980s.
One of my recruiting tools was to run Gasparilla and try to beat him. So it was like I'm out there running with Roger, not really prepared for quite how good he was. And I'm thinking, if I run with this guy, and I can run 5-minute pace for 15K, if I run with this guy, he might think that we got something going, knowing he could come train with me and all the guys over at USF. And we went through 10K at like 31:01. And I started to tie up, and I said, I better hold it together. There's 5K to go. And Roger just kept going. He ran something incredible that day. We were 5-minute pace at 10K, and he slowed down. I think he probably finished in 5:10s or 5:12s. And it may have been one of those years he ran Gasparilla where the wind was crazy on the comeback. Like it was out and back, and it might have stood you up on the way back. And it might have been one of those years. But just an incredible, talented guy.
In his mid-teens, Roger was one of the country's top runners. Perhaps like Keith Brantley and others mentioned in the show, Roger had dreams of making the Olympics. I'm going to close out the episode with a guy who did make it to the Olympics in an endurance sport. And he's someone you heard from in episode 15 and also in the first bonus episode, talking about trying to chase down Pat McDonough. His name is Nick Radkowicz, and like Roger Letchworth, he was a known commodity as a teenager. He was a standout runner and also a standout swimmer. That combination made him one of the nation's top triathletes. As you may recall, Radkowicz attended Lyman High School outside Orlando. I believe it was the first year that triathlon was an Olympic sport that you went. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
What is that like to say, hey, I was an Olympian in something that I did, from age whatever to age 30, 13. I guess.
Yeah, 13 I started. Tavares, Florida. My first race. The funny thing about it, to me, is that it was just what I enjoyed doing. Like, I loved running cross country, especially when I got to Notre Dame, because it was a really... We were more like a Largo or a Lado in that we had some tradition. We had a really tight group. We really ran as a team. We trained as a team, that sort of thing. But there was always like a bit of swimming that I missed. And I started to swim a little bit there. And that's when I actually ran better. And since I was a little kid, I always just rode my bike everywhere. So for me, it was just doing the stuff that I enjoyed. And it actually, I got to do it professionally, and then I got to go to the Olympics. So that was awesome. But the other end of that was when I was 14, I guess. I did the Iron Kids National Championship, and I beat this kid, Lance Armstrong. And when we were doing it, they actually said on the like ESPN broadcast that, it'll be guys like Nick and Lance racing in the Olympics someday. And I think my parents might have reminded me of that like every single year.
Oh man!
So when
as a podcast host, I resisted the urge to exclaim about 4 times in that. So yes, sorry. Continue.
Yeah, it just it just was always there. It was always kind of hanging there, and like every once in a while, someone would ask me for a copy of the ESPN broadcast because they were doing something for Lance, and it was like, oh, geez, it's gonna come up again. The Olympics and triathlon, we weren't even in the sport. So it was like, great, or in the Olympics. So, when it finally got in there, then it was kind of like, oh, I better make it. And I had a lousy first qualifying race, absolutely horrific. So I had to make it to the second one. And fortunately, it all came together that day. But then I got to the Olympics and, it was all about making it. I had a so disappointing race when I got there because it was, I just didn't have anything left. I put everything emotionally into making it.
Right.
And I realized that they were so fast that there was no way I was going to get a medal. So what was the point in coming back?
Interesting.
Like,
wow.
Yeah. I mean, it was so impressive how people, I mean, it's once every 4 years. I think there were a lot of realizations when I made it, a lot of lessons learned. It's once every 4 years to be on one day. I mean, think about McDonough. He needed to be on one day, but he ran 4 state meets in cross country. So, he got another shot at it, every year. Olympics, maybe you get to make it once in your life. Even if you're one of these repeat guys, it's like every 4 years you got to have it right on that day.
Yeah.
That was kind of daunting.
I can imagine. I mean, I can't really imagine, but I can,
Yeah, but the experience of it for me, that was my takeaway. Since I didn't have a medal to show everybody, but the experience for us triathlon was huge in Sydney, in Australia. So like when we would fly to races, they would know us because our races in the US would be broadcast in Australia. They wouldn't be broadcast in the US.
Right.
And so they would know us. And then Hunter Kemper and I, that I grew up, he's Orlando guy, ran for
Wake Forest, right? Did he go to Wake?
Yeah. He went to Lake Brantley and then went to Wake.
Yep.
We made the team together, and we actually went down and did a Visa commercial in Sydney at the Opera House January, and then made the team, and then went down and raced together. And we went to like every single sport. We went to every day of track and field, prelims and finals. We went to swimming. We went to women's soccer, cycling. I mean, we went to everything because our race was the second day, and they usually send you home like 2 days after your race or event. But we, as an endurance sport, weren't allowed to do the opening ceremonies. We raced the second day, and then they let us stay the entire games so we could do the closing ceremonies. And we took advantage of it. It's free tickets to everything.
Coach Haley and the Packers of Largo. Coach Ennis and the Lato Long Red Robe. Friends and rivals running across the bay. Been 50 years, but we've still got a lot to say.